Mark had dreamed of this moment for years. A fresh start in a peaceful, picture-perfect neighborhood. When he first stepped onto the manicured lawns of Willow Creek Estates, the gentle rustle of maple leaves and the faint scent of blooming roses promised exactly that: calm, order, and community. Neighbors waved as he unloaded boxes, their smiles warm but cautious. This was the kind of place where life felt safe. But sometimes, safety wore a mask. 2 days after moving in, Mark found a crisp white envelope slipped under his front door. No return address. The elegant script on the front read simply, "Notice of conduct violation." Curious, he tore it open. Inside was a terse message from the HOA board. "Dear Mr. Mark Jensen, it has come to our attention that certain behaviors on your property are inconsistent with Willow Creek Estates community standards. We advise you to review the HOA guidelines immediately to avoid further action. Failure to comply will result in penalties. Thank you for your cooperation." Mark frowned. What behavior? He'd only just arrived. He flipped through the HOA booklet, left on his kitchen counter. But nothing he'd done seemed out of line. Shrugging, he decided it must be a mistake. An overzealous board member trying to flex power. But that night, as the streetlights flickered on, Mark noticed something odd. A small black camera was mounted on the corner of the community mailbox, angled directly at his house. He squinted, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. It wasn't just a camera. It was surveillance. The next morning, Mark spotted another one, this time on the lamppost near his driveway. His stomach tightened. Who was watching and why? Was this a community safety measure or something more sinister? Over the following days, unease crept in like a shadow. Mark found his garbage bins tipped over, scattered along the curb like a warning. A neighbor he tried to befriend gave a tight-lipped smile and hurried away when Mark mentioned the cameras. His mailbox, once full of welcome flyers, now contained shredded envelopes or nothing at all. Mark's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Rules are rules. We're watching." Heart pounding. Mark felt the perfect neighborhood slipping away, replaced by a silent siege. He wasn't just a new resident. He was a target. One evening, determined to reclaim his peace, Mark planted a small garden statue in his front yard. A modest, hand-carved angel he'd brought from his old home. It was harmless, a simple decoration to brighten his space. Yet the next morning, a second letter awaited him. This one more urgent. "Your unauthorized ornament violates Section 4, Paragraph 12 of the HOA covenants. You have 48 hours to remove it or face escalating consequences." Mark stood frozen, staring at the angel, perched innocently among tulips. The message wasn't just about rules. It was a warning. The HOA was flexing its muscle, and he was the one in their sights. That night, the street was unusually quiet, but Mark could swear he heard footsteps outside his window. Peering through the curtains, he saw a shadow moving swiftly toward the next block. A chill ran down his spine. Was this the calm before a storm? Mark's mind raced. Who was running this covert operation? What would come next? His rights, his privacy, even his safety, all seemed to hang in a fragile balance. The perfect neighborhood was no longer just a dream. It was a battleground. Mark's days blurred into a tense routine. Each morning, he cautiously stepped outside, scanning his surroundings for new signs of surveillance or sabotage. The neighborhood's warm veneer had cracked, replaced by a creeping paranoia that settled deep in his bones. It started with small things. A trash bin mysteriously overturned in the dead of night, leaving broken cans and scattered debris as a silent message. Then came the missing mail, more frequent and deliberate than mere chance. Flyers, personal letters, even official bills vanished without a trace. Mark wondered if the HOA was behind it, or if someone else in the community had taken matters into their own hands. One afternoon, trying to shake off the growing unease, Mark ventured to the community park. It was a rare spot where neighbors gathered, a place for kids to play and adults to chat. He hoped to find an ally. But when he mentioned the cameras and letters to a woman pushing a stroller, she stiffened. "You don't want to mess with the board," she warned quietly, glancing over her shoulder. "They don't just enforce rules, they intimidate. And if you push back, things get ugly." Mark frowned. What could be so ugly about a homeowners association? That evening, as he prepared dinner, Mark heard the faint sound of a lawnmower. Outside, the once pristine grass near his garden statue was being shredded under heavy blades. His heart sank. Someone was deliberately destroying his property. Frustrated, Mark stormed outside to confront the culprit, but no one was around. Only the shredded remnants of his tulip patch remained, and the cold wind whispered through the broken stems. He felt trapped in a war he hadn't started. A battle against an invisible enemy, armed with rules, threats, and fear, determined not to give in. Mark decided to reach out to the HOA board for answers. He drafted an email requesting a meeting, hoping to clear the air and understand what exactly he had done to draw their ire. Days passed with no response. Then, late one night, Mark's phone buzzed. An anonymous text lit up the screen. "Stop digging, or the consequences will get worse." The message was chilling, but Mark wasn't the type to back down. On a particularly restless afternoon, Mark noticed a group of neighbors gathered by the community clubhouse. Curiosity got the better of him, and he approached cautiously. Through whispered conversations, he learned whispers of neighbors who had also felt the HOA's heavy hand. Fines for trivial infractions, threats of legal action, even social isolation. For speaking out, Mark's heart pounded. This wasn't just about his garden statue anymore. The HOA's tactics were systematic, designed to control every inch of residents' lives. That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table, poring over the HOA's rulebook again. Hidden in the fine print was a clause that allowed the board to impose reasonable restrictions on personal property to maintain community standards. The language was vague enough to be weaponized, but Mark wasn't about to let them bully him. He decided to fight back, quietly at first. Mark began documenting everything, every letter, every strange incident, every conversation. He set up his own camera to capture the nighttime disturbances. The silent war was escalating, but now he had evidence. One evening, as Mark reviewed the footage, a chilling scene played out on screen. A figure cloaked in dark clothing was caught on camera, rifling through his trash cans. The figure glanced directly at the camera, then disappeared into the shadows. Mark's pulse quickened. Someone was watching him. Not just the HOA board, but an agent of intimidation lurking in the night. The stakes had risen far beyond petty disputes, wassailated and under siege. Mark realized the only way out was to stand his ground and uncover the secrets behind the HOA's relentless grip. Mark's world was shrinking. What was once a place of comfort now felt like a cage tightening around him. The subtle harassment had evolved into a calculated siege. It started with a call from the HOA manager, Evelyn Graves. Her voice was silky, but her words cut sharp. "Mark, we've received several complaints about noise from your property," she said smoothly. "Neighbors are concerned. You know the rules about quiet hours. We expect full compliance moving forward." Mark blinked. Noise complaints? The only sounds from his home were the soft hum of his air conditioner. and the occasional click of his keyboard as he worked late into the night. "Is this about the garden statue again?" he asked, irritation creeping in. "No," Evelyn replied, her tone icy. "This is serious. We've been very patient." Mark knew very patient was code for "we're coming for you." Days later, Mark planned a small backyard barbecue with a few friends, a way to reclaim his peace and normalcy. The sun was setting, laughter floated in the warm air, and the smell of grilled food filled the yard. It should have been a moment of joy. Instead, it became the turning point. Without warning, flashing blue and red lights filled the driveway. 2 uniformed police officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, some nodding with quiet approval. One officer approached Mark. "We received noise complaints. You'll need to turn down your gathering." Mark's heart pounded. The police were here because of the HOA's complaints. But was this really about noise? Or something else? He kept his voice calm but firm. "Officer, this is a private gathering. We're within legal noise limits. Can I see the complaints?" The officer hesitated, then shook his head. "I'm just following orders." Behind the officers, Mark spotted Evelyn watching intently. Her lips curled in a small victorious smile. The tension was suffocating. Mark knew the HOA had weaponized the police against him. But instead of backing down, Mark's resolve hardened. He calmly asked for the officers' names and badge numbers, then reminded them of his rights. The officers, sensing his knowledge, quickly left, but the message was clear. Mark was under siege, and the HOA had the power to summon forces against him. That night, Mark couldn't sleep. He pored over local laws, searching for protections against unjust police involvement in HOA disputes. His research uncovered disturbing truths. Some HOAs had formed unofficial alliances with local law enforcement, turning neighborhood disputes into legal battlegrounds. The more he dug, the more dangerous the waters became. Mark realized he wasn't just fighting a few overbearing neighbors. He was battling a system designed to control, intimidate, and silence dissent. He began documenting every interaction, recording conversations with the HOA and the police, and noting the exact times and details of each event. His home became a fortress of evidence. But the HOA wasn't finished. One morning, Mark awoke to find bright orange notices plastered all over his front yard. Violation, unauthorized vehicle parking. The HOA claimed his guest's car was parked illegally and threatened fines and towing. Mark's blood boiled. The car had been parked legally, but the HOA was now twisting facts to pile on pressure. He called the towing company to confirm, then removed the notices himself, placing them in a sealed envelope labeled evidence. The community he'd once admired had turned hostile, its rules bending to serve a hidden agenda. Mark realized the battle lines were drawn. Would he break under pressure, or fight harder for his home, his rights, and his sanity? Mark had been bracing for this moment, but nothing could fully prepare him for the sudden pounding on his front door late one Tuesday evening. His heart skipped as he glanced at the clock. 10:15 p.m. Well past quiet hours, but this wasn't the usual knock of a neighbor. The door rattled under firm, authoritative knocks. He opened it cautiously to find 2 uniformed police officers standing on his porch, their faces unreadable in the dim porch light. Behind them, in the shadows, a figure lingered. Evelyn Graves, the HOA manager, her eyes sharp and calculating. "Good evening, Mr. Jensen," one officer began. "We received complaints about noise and disturbances from your property." Mark's mind raced. He knew this was no ordinary noise complaint. The HOA had called them in, weaponizing law enforcement to intimidate him. "I'm aware of my rights," Mark said calmly. stepping outside but keeping his tone respectful. "Can you tell me exactly what the complaints are and who filed them?" The officer hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with his partner. "That information isn't available right now. We're here to ensure peace and order." Mark's stomach tightened. He wasn't about to be railroaded by vague accusations. "Am I under investigation? Am I being cited for anything?" he asked. "No, sir," the officer replied. "We just want to keep the peace." Mark's gaze flicked to Evelyn, whose lips twitched into a smug smile. The message was clear. The HOA was using the police as pawns in their game. "I appreciate your role," Mark said, "but if there's no formal complaint or citation, I'd ask that you respect my privacy and property rights." The officers lingered for a moment, scanning the quiet street. The tension was thick, like a storm about to break. Then, unexpectedly, a neighbor from across the street stepped outside, waving his hands to calm the situation. "Sorry, officers," he said. "There's been no disturbance here tonight." The officers nodded, seeming to deflate. Evelyn's smile vanished as she realized the narrative wasn't holding. After a terse exchange of words, the officers turned and left, leaving Mark standing on his porch in the sudden silence. But the moment wasn't over. As the officer's cruiser disappeared down the street, Mark felt eyes on him from every window and shadow. The HOA had made its move, and the neighborhood was watching, waiting to see if he'd crack. Instead, Mark's jaw tightened. He was standing his ground. That night, he sat at his desk, the weight of the encounter pressing down on him. He reviewed his notes, taped copies of HOA letters, photographs of the surveillance cameras, and recordings from his own security system. He wasn't just defending his home anymore. He was defending his rights, his dignity, and his future. Mark knew he needed help, legal help. He found the number of a local non-profit specializing in homeowner rights and made the call. The voice on the other end was calm but firm, assuring him that intimidation tactics like these weren't unusual, but they could be fought. Armed with that hope, Mark prepared for the next battle. Outside, the street remained eerily silent, but inside Mark's home, a quiet determination blazed bright. The HOA had called in the cops to scare him, but Mark wasn't scared. He was ready. With the police visit still fresh in his mind, Mark knew the battle was no longer just about garden statues or noise complaints. It was about power, control, and a network of shadowy tactics designed to crush dissent. Determined not to be a victim, Mark dove headfirst into research. He spent nights poring over HOA documents, municipal codes, and legal forums. The more he learned, the darker the picture became. The Willow Creek Estates, HOA, wasn't just a community group. It was a fortress of control. Hidden deep in the fine print of their covenants were vague clauses granting the board sweeping authority to impose fines, restrict property use, and even involve law enforcement if they deemed a resident a disturbance. But even that was only part of the story. Mark discovered an underground network of former residents who had fled Willow Creek Estates under mysterious circumstances. Online forums and social media groups buzzed with whispered warnings, stories of harassment, fines that doubled overnight, and neighbors mysteriously ostracized or pushed to sell their homes. One post caught Mark's eye. A detailed account from a woman named Sarah, who had recorded an HOA meeting where board members openly discussed making an example of troublesome residents. Her recordings revealed a chilling truth. The HOA board wasn't just enforcing rules. They were strategizing harassment campaigns, using legal loopholes and unofficial connections with local police to intimidate homeowners into silence. Mark's heart pounded. If these stories were true, he wasn't just fighting a neighborhood dispute. He was up against a well-oiled machine. He reached out to Sarah through the forum, and she responded cautiously, but with urgency. "I'm glad you found me," she wrote. "I had to leave everything behind to escape. But you're right, knowledge is power. If you want to survive here, you have to stay one step ahead." Together, they began piecing together a plan. Sarah shared documents and recordings she'd kept, a map of HOA surveillance spots, logs of aggressive board actions, even hints about secret meetings where the board plotted next moves. Mark felt a surge of hope. He wasn't alone. To counter the HOA's power, Mark set up his own surveillance cameras, carefully placed to capture every suspicious movement around his property. He upgraded his security system and backed up all evidence in multiple locations. Every letter, every notice, every encounter was logged meticulously. At the same time, Mark began educating himself on tenant rights, noise ordinances, and the limits of HOA authority under state law. He drafted polite but firm letters, responding to every complaint, citing specific legal protections, and demanding transparency. Each letter was a message. He knew his rights, and he wasn't afraid to use them. But the greatest weapon was the truth. Mark started contacting local journalists anonymously, sharing Sarah's recordings and his own evidence. He wanted to expose the HOA's shadow games before anyone else got trapped in their web. Still, Mark remained cautious. The HOA's reach was long, and he sensed eyes watching his every move. One night, while reviewing his surveillance footage, Mark noticed something unsettling. A figure lurking near his driveway. The person wore a hood, their face hidden. They paused, looked directly at the camera, then disappeared into the darkness. His pulse quickened. The fight wasn't just legal. It was personal. Mark steeled himself. The HOA had turned their power into a weapon, but he was no longer the hunted. He was the hunter. The night air was thick with tension as Mark sat in his living room, eyes fixed on the flickering screen of his security camera feed. The hooded figure had become a recurring shadow, a silent menace stalking the edges of his property. Tonight, Mark knew, would be different. Earlier that evening, Mark had received another letter from the HOA. This one was harsher than the rest. Final warning. Failure to comply with community regulations will result in immediate legal action. But Mark wasn't intimidated. Not anymore. He'd arranged for a trusted friend, Lisa, to stay with him overnight. Lisa, a sharp-minded lawyer, had offered her help after hearing Mark's story. Together, they were ready to face whatever the HOA threw at them. Suddenly, the front porch light flickered on. Mark and Lisa exchanged glances. Someone was outside. Mark grabbed his phone and quietly stepped toward the front window, camera app ready. Through the glass, he saw the figure again, the same hooded person, now closer, shifting nervously on the porch. Mark's voice was steady, but firm as he stepped outside. "Can I help you?" The figure froze, then slowly pulled back the hood, revealing a young man with a nervous expression. I'm sorry." The man stammered. "I didn't mean to scare you. I was told to keep an eye on your property." Mark's blood ran cold. "Told by who?" "The HOA. Evelyn asked me to monitor you. Make sure you weren't breaking any rules." Mark's fists clenched. The harassment wasn't just intimidation. It was organized surveillance, paid for by the association. Lisa stepped forward. "Do you have a contract or payment proof? We need to know if this surveillance is legal." The young man shook his head. "No paperwork. I was just hired off the books. I didn't want to get involved, but I needed the money." Mark's mind raced. The HOA was crossing legal lines. using unlicensed private eyes to spy on residents. "We're going to report this," Lisa said firmly. "This is a serious violation of privacy." The man nodded, relief washing over his face. "I'll tell you everything." Back inside, Mark and Lisa listened as the man described the HOA's tactics: threats, covert surveillance, and using legal loopholes to bully homeowners into submission. Evelyn was the mastermind. Coordinating these moves, like a general preparing for war, Mark's resolve hardened. The HOA had revealed its hand, and now he had proof. The next day, Mark filed a formal complaint with the local police department and the state's Consumer Protection Agency, submitting the surveillance footage and the young man's testimony. But the retaliation came faster than he expected. That evening, a black SUV parked suspiciously near Mark's house. He spotted figures inside, watching. The same feeling of being hunted returned in full force. Mark knew the HOA wasn't going to quit until he was crushed or driven out. Yet, amidst the danger, Mark found unexpected allies. A few neighbors who had remained silent finally stepped forward, sharing their own stories of harassment and intimidation. They joined Mark's fight, unwilling to let their community be ruled by fear. Together, they planned to take the HOA to court. As Mark looked out over the neighborhood that had once promised peace, he realized the fight was no longer just about him. It was about standing up against a system designed to control and silence. Mark was ready to face whatever came next. The silence in the neighborhood was no longer peaceful. It was the quiet before a storm. Mark's phone buzzed relentlessly with texts and calls from neighbors who had finally found their voice. The tide was turning. That afternoon, Mark organized a community meeting at the local library. Flyers had gone out quietly, no HOA involvement, and the turnout surprised him. Nearly a dozen residents arrived, each bearing stories of fines, threats, and intimidation. Margaret, a grandmother with tears in her eyes, told how the HOA had threatened to fine her $500 for planting flowers deemed inappropriate. Jim, a middle-aged man, shared how the board had frozen his pool's use after a minor fence dispute. Others spoke of social ostracism, with friends and neighbors turning cold at the HOA's silent bidding. Mark listened, the weight of their stories fueling his determination. Lisa, his lawyer friend, stood at the front, explaining the residents' legal rights and the limits of HOA power. "The law is on your side," she said firmly. "HOAs must follow clear rules and cannot use intimidation or illegal surveillance. We will hold them accountable." The room buzzed with energy and hope. But even as the community rallied, the pushback intensified. That night, Mark's security cameras caught shadowy figures vandalizing his mailbox and slashing the tires of a car parked in his driveway. The message was unmistakable: back down or face consequences. Mark's heart pounded, but he refused to give in. He forwarded the footage to the police and posted a neighborhood alert warning others to be vigilant. The battle was no longer just legal. It was personal and dangerous. Yet the courage of Mark and his allies inspired others. More neighbors came forward, sharing stories and evidence of HOA abuse. A grassroots network blossomed, united by a common goal: reclaim their community from fear. In the weeks that followed, the story caught the attention of local media. Journalists began investigating the HOA's actions, exposing their questionable tactics and misuse of power. Faced with mounting pressure, the HOA board grew desperate. Evelyn Graves ramped up her threats, sending aggressive letters warning residents of lawsuits and fines if they spoke publicly. But the community stood firm. At a packed HOA meeting, Mark and his supporters presented their evidence, demanding transparency and reform. The tension in the room was electric. Board members shifted uneasily as accusations flew. Then, just when it seemed the board might crumble, Evelyn made a shocking announcement. "I resign," she said coldly, her eyes scanning the room. Effective immediately, gasps echoed throughout the hall. The once powerful architect of intimidation was gone, but the scars remained. Mark realized the fight was far from over. New leaders would rise, and the struggle for control would continue. But now, the neighborhood had awakened. Fear no longer ruled, and Mark had proven one simple truth. You don't have to be alone in the fight. The dust was just beginning to settle in Willow Creek Estates. Evelyn's resignation had shaken the foundation of the HOA, and the neighborhood buzzed with cautious optimism. Mark felt a tentative victory, but he knew better than to let his guard down. After everything, peace was fragile. The new HOA board, members, handpicked from the neighborhood's most vocal critics, promised reform and transparency. They invited Mark to help draft new policies to protect residents' rights. For the first time in months, Mark dared to breathe easier, but just when he thought the nightmare was over, the unexpected happened. One evening, Mark received an anonymous envelope slid under his door. Inside was a USB drive and a simple note, "Look closer. The real puppeteer is still pulling the strings." Curiosity and dread mingled in Mark's mind as he plugged the USB into his computer. What he found was astonishing. A trove of emails, contracts, and recordings, revealing a web far more complex than he imagined. Evelyn Graves hadn't acted alone. Behind the scenes, a local real estate developer named Carson Vale had been financing the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Vale had been quietly buying properties in the neighborhood, pressuring homeowners to sell at below-market prices, then flipping the homes for massive profits. The HOA's harassment campaign was a smokescreen, designed to scare out anyone who refused to sell. Mark's heart pounded. The very foundation of his community had been manipulated by greed. He shared the evidence with Lisa and the neighborhood coalition. Together, they prepared to expose Carson Vale. The local media erupted with the scandal, and a legal investigation was launched. Vale's empire began to crumble under public scrutiny. For Mark, the battle had transformed from a fight against a controlling HOA to a fight against corporate greed, threatening the heart of his neighborhood. The final showdown came at a packed city council meeting. Mark stood before the council, flanked by neighbors, presenting the evidence with quiet conviction. Willow Creek Estates is more than just property, Mark said. It's home, and we will not let greed and intimidation destroy it. The council voted unanimously to impose strict regulations on real estate speculation and increased oversight of HOAs. As Mark left the chamber, a surge of relief and triumph washed over him. But more than that, he felt a renewed sense of community. Neighbors, who once hid behind closed doors, now greeted each other on the street. They had reclaimed their neighborhood, not through silence or fear, but through courage and unity. Mark looked around his home, the garden statue still standing defiantly in the front yard, and smiled. The HOA had tried to use cops and intimidation to push him out, but Mark knew his rights, stood his ground, and in doing so, had sparked a revolution. In Willow Creek Estates, the people had won.